The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Valdoria Palace as King Edmund III stood before the ornate mirror in his private chambers. At 68, his weathered face bore the weight of 40 years on the throne. But today something else haunted his gray eyes, a secret that had festered in his heart for decades. Queen Isabella entered the chamber, her silver hair perfectly arranged despite the early hour. She had been his companion for 35 years, standing by his side through countless state functions, family tragedies, and the endless scrutiny of public life. Yet Edmund knew that what he was about to reveal would test the very foundation of their relationship. The palace had been unusually quiet lately. Their eldest son, Prince Alexander, was traveling abroad on diplomatic missions, while their daughter Princess Charlotte was managing her own royal duties in the northern provinces. The timing seemed right, though Edmund wondered if there would ever truly be a right time for such a confession. Earlier that week, Edmund had received a letter that changed everything. The handwriting was familiar yet distant, belonging to someone from his past whom he thought he would never hear from again. Lady Victoria Ashworth, now in her 70s, had written to inform him that she was dying and could no longer carry the burden of their shared secret. The letter revealed that during the early years of his marriage to Isabella, when their relationship was strained and formal as many royal marriages were, Edmund had found solace in Victoria's company. What started as friendship had blossomed into something deeper during those lonely months when Isabella was dealing with her own struggles adapting to royal life. Victoria's letter contained photographs and documents that proved their brief but intense relationship had resulted in consequences neither of them had anticipated. There was a child, a son named Marcus, now 34 years old, who had grown up believing his father was Victoria's late husband, Lord Ashworth. Edmund remembered those days with painful clarity. Victoria had approached him quietly about her pregnancy, and together they had made the decision that seemed best for everyone involved. Lord Ashworth, who was infertile due to a childhood illness, had agreed to claim the child as his own. The secret was buried, Victoria moved away from court, and Edmund threw himself into his royal duties with renewed dedication. As the years passed, Edmund had convinced himself that he had made the right choice. Marcus grew up privileged and loved. Isabella never knew about the affair, and the monarchy remained stable. But Victoria's letter forced him to confront the truth he had been avoiding, that Marcus deserved to know his real father, and Isabella deserved to know the truth about her husband. The weight of deception had grown heavier with each passing year. Every time Edmund looked at his legitimate children, he thought about the son he had never truly known. Every time Isabella spoke about their family with pride, he felt the sting of his betrayal. The guilt had shaped his decisions for decades, making him overly cautious and sometimes distant, even from those he loved most. Edmund walked to his desk and pulled out Victoria's letter once more. She had included a recent photograph of Marcus, and the resemblance was undeniable. The same strong jawline, the same piercing gray eyes, even the same way of holding his shoulders. Anyone who looked closely would see the royal bloodline written clearly in his features. The king's hands trembled slightly as he folded the letter and placed it in his jacket pocket. He had made his decision during the long, sleepless nights following its arrival. He would tell Isabella everything, regardless of the consequences. She had been his partner in ruling the kingdom, and she deserved to be his partner in facing this truth as well. Isabella noticed his unusual demeanor immediately. After 35 years of marriage, she could read his moods better than anyone. She approached him with concern, placing a gentle hand on his arm. "Edmund, you've been troubled for days. What's weighing so heavily on your mind?" He looked into her eyes, those same warm brown eyes that had captivated him when they were young, and felt his resolve nearly crumble. How could he shatter the trust that had taken decades to build? How could he explain that the man she had shared her life with had been harboring such a significant deception? "Isabella, there's something I need to tell you. Something I should have told you many years ago." The Queen's expression shifted from concern to apprehension. She had learned to recognize the gravity in her husband's voice, the tone he used when delivering news that would change everything. "Perhaps we should sit down," she suggested, guiding him to the pair of chairs by the window where they often shared their morning tea. As they settled into their seats, Edmund realized there was no gentle way to reveal what he had done. The secret had grown too large, too significant to be softened by careful words or gradual disclosure. He reached into his pocket and withdrew Victoria's letter, his hands no longer trembling but steady with determined resolve. 35 years ago, during the early years of our marriage, I made choices that I've regretted every day since. Choices that affected not just us, but brought another life into this world. Isabella's face grew pale as she began to understand the implications of his words. The careful composure she had maintained as queen for decades started to slip as the reality of what her husband was about to confess became clear. Edmund handed her the letter, watching as her eyes scanned the words that would change their lives forever. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the distant sounds of the palace staff beginning their daily routines. Unaware that the very foundation of the royal family was shifting beneath their feet, the letter slipped from Isabella's fingers and fluttered to the Persian rug below like a fallen leaf. For long moments, she sat motionless, staring at her husband with an expression he had never seen before, a mixture of disbelief, pain, and something that might have been recognition of a truth she had long suspected but never voiced. "Victoria Ashworth," Isabella whispered, her voice barely audible. "I remember her. She was always at court functions in those early years, always finding reasons to speak with you." Edmund felt a chill run down his spine. Had Isabella known? Had she suspected something all those years ago but chosen to remain silent? The thought that his wife might have carried her own burden of unspoken knowledge made his guilt even more unbearable. "Isabella, I don't." She held up her hand, stopping his words. "Not yet. I need to understand everything before you start explaining or apologizing." The queen rose from her chair with the grace that had defined her public persona for decades, but Edmund could see the tremor in her hands as she picked up the letter and walked to the window. The morning light illuminated the silver streaks in her hair, making her appear both regal and fragile. She read Victoria's words again, more slowly this time, absorbing every detail about Marcus, the son Edmund had never acknowledged, the boy who had grown up believing Lord Ashworth was his father, the man who was now 34 years old and had children of his own. "He has your eyes," Isabella said suddenly, still facing the window. "In the photograph. He has your eyes and Alexander's chin." The observation hit Edmund like a physical blow. Of course, she would notice the resemblance immediately. She had studied his face for over 3 decades, had watched their children grow up carrying pieces of his features. She would recognize the royal bloodline in Marcus just as clearly as anyone else would. "Yes," he admitted quietly. "The resemblance is unmistakable." Isabella turned back to face him, and Edmund was struck by how different she looked. The warm, comfortable familiarity that had existed between them just minutes before had been replaced by the careful distance of strangers. It was as if she was seeing him clearly for the first time in years. "Tell me everything," she commanded, and there was steel in her voice that reminded him why she had been such an effective queen. "From the beginning. I want to know exactly how this happened, and why you chose to keep it from me for 35 years. Edmund began with the loneliness of their early marriage. He spoke honestly about how their relationship had been formal and distant in those first years, arranged by their families for political reasons rather than love. He explained how Isabella had struggled with the transition to royal life, how she had seemed overwhelmed and often withdrew from him emotionally. "I'm not making excuses," he clarified when he saw her expression harden. "I'm simply trying to help you understand the circumstances. I was young and foolish and deeply unhappy." Isabella listened without interruption as he described his friendship with Victoria, how it had gradually deepened into something more intimate. He told her about the months they had spent together, meeting in secret, finding comfort in each other's company while their respective spouses remained unaware. "When Victoria told me she was pregnant, we both knew immediately that the child was mine. Lord Ashworth had been honest with her about his inability to have children, but he loved her enough to claim the baby as his own." "And you let him," Isabella said, her voice flat and emotionless. "We thought it was the best solution for everyone involved. Marcus would have a father who wanted him. Victoria would have a stable marriage. You would never have to know about my betrayal. And the monarchy would remain untainted by scandal." Isabella laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "The best solution for everyone? What about me, Edmund? What about my right to know the truth about the man I was married to? What about my right to make my own decisions about our marriage based on complete information?" The question hung in the air between them like an accusation. Edmund realized that in all his years of justifying his choices, he had never truly considered how his deception had robbed Isabella of her agency. She had spent 35 years building a life and a partnership based on incomplete truth. And what about Marcus? Isabella continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. What about his right to know his real father? his right to understand his heritage, his place in the royal line of succession. This was the aspect of the secret that had tormented Edmund most in recent years. As Marcus had grown into adulthood, married, and started his own family, the king had watched from afar, knowing that his son was living without any knowledge of his true parentage. Victoria kept me informed about his life, Edmund admitted. She would send photographs, updates about his education, his career. He became a successful architect, married a wonderful woman named Sarah, has 2 young daughters. Granddaughters, Isabella said sharply. You have granddaughters you've never met. Children who are part of this family whether we acknowledge them or not. The weight of what he had lost, and what his family had lost, crashed over Edmund like a wave. 2 little girls who carried royal blood in their veins, growing up completely unaware of their heritage. Marcus, who might have found comfort and identity in knowing his true father. Isabella, who had been denied the opportunity to know her husband's eldest child and perhaps develop a relationship with him. Victoria is dying, Edmund said quietly. That's why she wrote to me now. She wants Marcus to know the truth before she goes, but she felt he deserved to hear it from me rather than discovering it in some letter after her death. Isabella moved away from the window and began pacing the length of the room, her mind clearly working through the implications of everything she had learned. Edmund watched her, remembering why he had fallen in love with her intelligence and strength even in their arranged marriage. So what exactly are you planning to do about this revelation? She asked finally. Are you intending to contact Marcus? To reveal to our children that they have a half-brother? To explain to the kingdom that their king has been living a lie for 35 years? The questions came like arrows, each one highlighting a different aspect of the complicated situation they now faced. Edmund realized that his decision to confess to Isabella was only the first step in a much longer and more difficult journey toward making things right. I don't know, he admitted. I only knew that I couldn't keep this secret from you any longer. Whatever we do next, we should decide together. Isabella stopped pacing and looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Together? You want to make decisions together now, after 35 years of making this particular decision entirely on your own. The bitter irony in her voice cut deep, but Edmund recognized that her anger was justified. He had broken their partnership from the very beginning by excluding her from the truth, and now he was asking her to help him figure out how to repair the damage. Before he could respond, a soft knock on the door interrupted their conversation. Their private secretary's voice came through the heavy oak doors, reminding them of their scheduled appearances for the day, a ceremony honoring veterans, followed by a state dinner with visiting dignitaries. Isabella straightened her shoulders and smoothed her hair, transforming back into the composed queen that the public expected to see. But when she looked at Edmund, her eyes held a coldness that made him understand that their private conversation was far from over. We have duties to attend to, she said formally. This discussion will have to continue later. But, Edmund, don't mistake my silence for forgiveness. What you've told me changes everything, and I need time to decide what I'm going to do about it. As she moved toward the door to begin their day of public appearances, Edmund realized that his confession had not brought the relief he had hoped for. Instead, it had opened a chasm between them that might prove impossible to bridge. The veterans' ceremony proceeded with all the pomp and dignity expected of such occasions. But Isabella felt as though she was watching herself perform from a distance. Her smile was perfectly calibrated, her words of gratitude appropriately heartfelt, yet every gesture felt mechanical and hollow. Your Majesty seems unusually quiet this evening, observed the Prime Minister's wife, a sharp-eyed woman named Elena who had always been perceptive during their previous encounters. Forgive me, Isabella replied smoothly. I've been contemplating some family matters that require careful consideration. The irony of her words was not lost on her. Family matters indeed. A son she had never known existed, grandchildren she had never met, and a husband whose fundamental dishonesty had just rewritten the entire history of their marriage. After the last guest had departed, and the palace staff had begun their evening routines, Isabella found herself alone in her private study. She had always retreated to this room when she needed to think clearly, surrounded by the books and artwork that reflected her personal tastes rather than royal protocol. Tonight, however, even this sanctuary felt tainted by the day's revelations. She pulled out her laptop and, after a moment's hesitation, typed Marcus Ashworth Architect into the search engine. The results were extensive. He had indeed built a successful career, with his firm responsible for several prestigious buildings throughout the kingdom. His professional website included a biography that mentioned his education at Cambridge, his marriage to Sarah, and his commitment to sustainable design. What struck Isabella most forcefully was how accomplished and grounded he appeared to be. This wasn't the story of a secret child struggling with abandonment or lack of opportunity. Lord Ashworth had clearly been a devoted father, and Victoria had provided Marcus with every advantage. In some ways, that made the situation even more complicated. There was no obvious injustice to rectify, no clear wrong that needed immediate correction. She clicked through to images from architectural magazines and society pages, studying this man who was technically her stepson. In several photographs, Marcus was pictured with his wife and daughters at charity events and school functions. The girls appeared to be around 6 and 8 years old, with bright smiles and the kind of confidence that came from growing up in a loving, stable family. A soft knock on her door interrupted her research. "Come in," she called, quickly closing the laptop. To her surprise, it was not her lady-in-waiting, but Prince Alexander, still wearing his travel clothes from his return to the kingdom that evening. At 32, he had inherited the best of both his parents' features and bore the weight of being heir apparent with dignity and intelligence. "Mother, forgive the intrusion, but I wanted to speak with you before I saw Father tomorrow. There are some concerning reports from my meetings with the neighboring kingdoms that I think you should be aware of." Isabella studied her son's earnest face and felt a wave of protectiveness wash over her. How would Alexander react to learning that he had an older half-brother? Would it change his understanding of his place in the succession? Would it affect his relationship with his father, whom he had always deeply respected? "Of course, darling. Please sit down." As Alexander settled into the chair opposite her desk, Isabella made a decision. She would not burden her children with this secret until she had determined the best path forward. They deserved to have their father explain his actions directly, not learn about them through her anger and confusion. Alexander spent 20 minutes briefing her on various diplomatic concerns, but Isabella found it difficult to focus completely. Her son's presence highlighted just how many people would be affected by Edmund's revelation, not just their immediate family, but the entire royal institution and the kingdom itself. After Alexander left to prepare for bed, Isabella returned to her laptop and continued her research. She found articles about Marcus's architectural philosophy, interviews where he discussed the importance of building structures that would last for generations. The irony was painful. Here was a man who devoted his professional life to creating lasting foundations, yet his own foundation was built on a lie. She discovered that his firm had actually done work for several royal properties over the years, renovating historic buildings and designing new staff quarters. It was entirely possible that Marcus had been in the same rooms as his biological father without either of them knowing it. The thought made Isabella feel slightly sick. Near midnight, she heard Edmund's footsteps in the corridor outside her study. He paused at her door, and she could sense his hesitation through the heavy wood. Part of her wanted to call out to him, to continue their earlier conversation and begin the difficult work of figuring out how to move forward. But a larger part of her was still too hurt and angry to face him again so soon. The footsteps continued down the hall toward his private chambers, and Isabella felt the weight of the physical and emotional distance that had opened between them. They had not slept apart since the early days of their marriage, but tonight the thought of sharing a bed with Edmund felt impossible. She spent another hour reading everything she could find about Marcus and his family, trying to understand the life that her husband had observed from afar for over 3 decades. By the time she finally closed the laptop, she had formed a preliminary plan. The next morning, Isabella woke early and dressed carefully in one of her more understated suits. She had made a decision during the sleepless hours before dawn, and she intended to act on it before she could lose her nerve. She placed a call to her private secretary, instructing him to clear her afternoon schedule and arrange for her personal car rather than the usual royal motorcade. Then, she sat down and wrote a careful note, sealing it in an envelope addressed to Marcus Ashworth's architectural firm. The note was brief and formal. "Mr. Ashworth, I would very much like to meet with you this afternoon to discuss a matter of mutual interest. Would you be available to meet at your office at 3 p.m.? Please confirm your availability with my secretary. Sincerely, Isabella." She deliberately did not use her royal title, hoping to keep the meeting as private and informal as possible. Whatever happened next, she wanted to form her own opinion of this man before she made any decisions about how to proceed. As she prepared to leave the palace for what might be the most important conversation of her life, Isabella caught sight of herself in the mirror. She looked every bit the queen she had been for 35 years, but inside she felt like a woman who was about to meet the key to understanding just how much of her life had been built on deception. The drive to Marcus's office took her through parts of the capital she rarely visited, past the everyday life of citizens who saw her only on ceremonial occasions. She wondered what they would think if they knew that their queen was on her way to meet the king's secret son, a man who had been hidden from them for over 3 decades. Marcus Ashworth's architectural office occupied the top floor of a beautifully restored Victorian building in the arts district of the capital. As Isabella's car pulled up to the curb, she could see through the large windows to where several young architects were bent over drafting tables, their workspace filled with natural light and carefully curated plants. It looked like the kind of creative, purposeful environment that spoke well of its owner. Her heart pounded as she rode the elevator to the 5th floor, still uncertain about what exactly she hoped to accomplish with this meeting. The receptionist, a young woman with kind eyes, seemed flustered when Isabella introduced herself simply as Mrs. Regina, the alias she sometimes used for private appointments. "Mr. Ashworth is waiting for you in his office," the receptionist said, leading her down a hallway lined with photographs of the firm's architectural projects. Isabella recognized several buildings she had visited in her official capacity, never knowing that Edmund's son had been responsible for their design. Marcus stood as she entered his office, and Isabella had to suppress a sharp intake of breath. The resemblance to Edmund was even more striking in person, not just the physical features, but the way he carried himself, the intelligent alertness in his expression. He was taller than his father, with the lean build of someone who stayed active, and his handshake was firm and confident. "Mrs. Regina, I have to admit I'm curious about what brings you to see me today. Your message was rather mysterious." Isabella had rehearsed several different approaches during the drive over, but now, faced with this man who was undeniably Edmund's son, she found herself momentarily speechless. How did one begin such a conversation? How did she explain who she was and why she was there without destroying his entire understanding of his identity? "I'm sorry for the unusual circumstances," she began, settling into the comfortable chair he offered. "But I believe you knew my late husband's cousin, Lady Victoria Ashworth." It was not entirely true. Victoria was still alive, though apparently not for much longer. But Isabella needed a way to ease into the real reason for her visit. Marcus's expression shifted immediately, becoming more guarded and concerned. "Victoria is my mother. Is she all right? Has something happened?" The genuine worry in his voice touched Isabella deeply. Whatever else Victoria had done, she had clearly raised a son who loved her deeply. "She's quite ill, I'm afraid. But that's not directly why I'm here." Isabella took a deep breath and made another decision. She reached into her purse and withdrew one of the formal photographs that hung in every government building throughout the kingdom, a recent portrait of the royal family. "Mr. Ashworth, I need to tell you something that will be quite shocking, but I hope you'll hear me out completely before you respond." Marcus took the photograph, studying it with the careful attention of someone accustomed to examining details. His eyes moved from Edmund to Alexander to Princess Charlotte, and Isabella watched as recognition began to dawn in his expression. "I don't understand," he said quietly, but his voice suggested that perhaps he was beginning to understand all too well. "My name is not Mrs. Regina," Isabella said gently. "I am Queen Isabella, and I have reason to believe that King Edmund is your biological father." The photograph slipped from Marcus's fingers just as Victoria's letter had fallen from hers the day before. He stared at Isabella for a long moment, his face cycling through disbelief, shock, and something that might have been recognition. "That's impossible," he whispered. "My father was Lord Ashworth. My mother would have told me if." "Your mother made a very difficult choice 35 years ago," Isabella said carefully. "She and my husband decided that it would be best for everyone if you grew up as Lord Ashworth's son. From everything I can see, you had a wonderful childhood and have built an impressive life." Marcus stood abruptly and walked to the window, his back to Isabella. She could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands clenched and unclenched as he processed what she had told him. "How long have you known?" he asked without turning around. "I learned yesterday morning. My husband confessed everything after receiving a letter from your mother. And you decided to come here without telling him? Without asking his permission?" The question revealed an astute understanding of royal protocol that impressed Isabella. Most people wouldn't immediately grasp the significance of a queen acting independently in such a matter. I needed to meet you myself before we decide how to handle this situation, she replied honestly. This affects not just my husband, but our children, our family, and potentially the kingdom itself. Marcus turned back to face her, and she could see tears threatening at the corners of his eyes. I always wondered, he admitted quietly. Lord Ashworth was a wonderful father, but I never looked like him at all. And my mother, sometimes she would get this distant look when I asked questions about my early childhood. What will you tell Sarah? Your daughters? The question seemed to ground Marcus in immediate practical concerns. He sat back down, running his hands through his hair, another gesture that reminded Isabella painfully of Edmund. I don't know. Sarah has always been curious about why I don't look like either of my parents. She's smart enough to have figured out that there might be more to the story. They sat in silence for several minutes, both of them grappling with the enormity of the situation. Finally, Marcus spoke again. What does he want from me? The king, I mean. Why reveal this now, after all these years? Isabella found herself in the strange position of defending Edmund's motivations to the son he had never acknowledged. I think he's carried the guilt for a very long time. And your mother's illness forced him to confront the fact that you deserve to know the truth about your parentage. And what do you want from me? Marcus asked, looking at her directly for the first time since her revelation. The question caught Isabella off guard. What did she want? She had come here primarily driven by anger and curiosity, needing to see for herself the person whose existence had rewritten her entire marriage. But, sitting across from this thoughtful, accomplished man who was so clearly Edmund's son, she found her emotions becoming more complex. I suppose I wanted to see who you are, she answered honestly. To understand what kind of person you've become, and to form my own opinion about how we should move forward. And what's your opinion so far? Isabella considered the question carefully. I think you're exactly the kind of son any parent would be proud of. I think Lord Ashworth did an excellent job raising you, and your mother should be commended for the difficult choices she made. But I also think you have a right to know your biological heritage, even if it complicates your life considerably. Marcus nodded slowly, absorbing her words. Would you like to see some of my work? Some of the buildings I've designed. The request was unexpected, but somehow perfectly appropriate. For the next hour, Marcus walked Isabella through his portfolio, explaining his design philosophy and showing her photographs of his completed projects. She was struck by his passion for creating spaces that honored both history and innovation, a perspective that seemed to reflect the man himself. As their conversation continued, Isabella found herself genuinely liking this person who was technically her stepson. He was thoughtful without being ponderous, confident without being arrogant, and clearly devoted to his family and his work. When it came time for her to leave, Marcus walked her to the elevator. Will you tell him that we met? He asked. Yes, but I want you to think about whether you'd like to meet him yourself. There's no pressure either way. This is your decision to make. As the elevator doors closed, Isabella saw Marcus still standing in the hallway, looking like a man whose entire world had just shifted on its axis. She understood the feeling completely. During the drive back to the palace, Isabella realized that her anger toward Edmund had evolved into something more complicated. She was still hurt by his deception, still betrayed by 35 years of lies. But she was also beginning to understand the impossible position he had found himself in as a young man, and the weight of the secret he had carried for so long. More importantly, she had discovered that Marcus Ashworth was not just Edmund's biological son, but a person worth knowing in his own right. Whatever happened next, she was determined that any resolution would honor the dignity and autonomy of all the people involved, including the two granddaughters she was now eager to meet. 3 weeks after Isabella's secret meeting with Marcus, the palace felt like a powder keg waiting to explode. Edmund had initially been shocked by his wife's independent action, then hurt that she hadn't trusted him to handle the situation appropriately. But, as the days passed, he began to understand that Isabella's need to meet Marcus herself was perhaps the most rational response to an impossible situation. They had established an uneasy truce, speaking civilly during their public appearances while maintaining a careful distance in their private moments. Isabella had shared her impressions of Marcus, describing him as thoughtful, accomplished, and remarkably well-adjusted despite the shocking revelation about his parentage. This information brought Edmund both relief and a deeper sense of loss, relief that his son had thrived, and loss for all the years they could never recover. The situation became more urgent when Princess Charlotte returned from her duties in the northern provinces for her younger brother Prince William's birthday celebration. At 28, Charlotte was perceptive and had inherited Isabella's ability to sense when something was amiss in the family dynamics. "Father looks terrible," Charlotte observed to Alexander during the private family dinner that preceded William's official birthday festivities. "And Mother seems to be maintaining her composure through sheer force of will. What's going on?" Alexander had noticed the same tension but assumed it was related to some political crisis he wasn't privy to. "Perhaps it's the ongoing negotiations with the trade unions," he suggested, though he didn't sound convinced. William, at 25, was more focused on his upcoming royal tour of South America and didn't seem to notice anything unusual. His cheerful obliviousness to the family drama provided a welcome distraction, but it also highlighted how dramatically their family dynamic was about to change. That evening, as the formal birthday celebration concluded and the last guests departed, Isabella found Edmund waiting for her in their private sitting room. It was the first time they had been truly alone together since his initial confession. "We can't continue like this," Edmund said without preamble. "The children are starting to notice that something's wrong, and we have a responsibility to handle this situation properly." Isabella settled into her chair, studying her husband's face. The past 3 weeks had aged him visibly. New lines around his eyes, a slightly stooped posture that spoke of carrying an enormous burden. She realized that her own appearance probably reflected similar strain. "Marcus has been thinking about everything," she told him. "He's spoken with Sarah, and they've decided they want to meet you. But he's also concerned about how this will affect his daughters." Edmund's expression shifted from apprehension to something approaching relief. "He wants to meet me? He says he needs to, for his own peace of mind. But he's also made it clear that he doesn't expect anything from us." But she also said she was glad he would finally know the truth. Over the following days, arrangements were made for a private meeting between Edmund and Marcus at a secluded royal property outside the capital. Isabella insisted on being present, both to support Edmund and to ensure that Marcus felt comfortable with the situation. The meeting took place on a quiet Sunday afternoon in the library of Rosewood House, a smaller royal residence that had been in Edmund's family for generations. Marcus arrived with Sarah, an intelligent woman with kind eyes who clearly provided her husband with steady support. The initial moments were awkward, filled with the weight of 35 years of separation and uncertainty. Edmund found himself studying every detail of his son's appearance, looking for traces of the baby he had never been allowed to hold, the child he had never been permitted to know. "I have to admit," Marcus said finally, "this is surreal. I've seen your photograph countless times, but I never imagined we would be sitting in the same room having this conversation." "I've wondered about you every day for 35 years, Edmund replied quietly. "I followed your career from a distance, celebrated your successes, worried during difficult times. But I always believed I had forfeited the right to be part of your life." Sarah spoke up, her voice gentle but direct. "What we're struggling to understand is why you made that choice. Why you decided that secrecy was better than acknowledgement." It was Isabella who answered, surprising everyone including herself. Because 35 years ago, illegitimate royal children were still considered scandals that could destabilize the monarchy. Because a young king was more concerned with protecting the institution than with facing the consequences of his personal choices. Her words hung in the air, simultaneously explaining and indicting Edmund's decision. Marcus nodded slowly, seeming to understand the historical context even as he grappled with its personal implications. "I need you to know," Edmund said, leaning forward in his chair, "that giving you up was the most difficult decision I've ever made. There hasn't been a day that I haven't questioned whether it was the right choice." "But you did make that choice," Marcus replied, his voice steady but not unkind. "And while I understand the circumstances, I need you to understand that it affected my entire life. Not negatively. Lord Ashworth was an excellent father. But I've always felt like there was a piece of my identity missing." The conversation continued for nearly 3 hours, covering everything from Marcus's childhood to his current concerns about how this revelation would affect his daughters. Both men seemed determined to approach the situation with honesty and mutual respect, despite the emotional complexity involved. As the meeting drew to a close, Marcus made a request that surprised everyone. "I'd like my daughters to meet their grandfather," he said, looking directly at Edmund. "Not as the king, but as family. They deserve to know where they come from, even if we decide to keep this private from the public." Edmund's eyes filled with tears at the word grandfather. It was a role he had never expected to claim, a relationship he had never dared to hope for. The arrangements were made for the following weekend. Emma and Sophie, ages 8 and 6, would come to Rosewood House for a family picnic. They had been told that they were meeting their mother's friend and her husband, not knowing that they were about to meet their biological grandfather and step-grandmother. As Isabella watched Edmund interact with his granddaughters for the first time, showing them the gardens, listening to their chatter about school and friends, teaching them the names of the peacocks that roamed the estate, she felt something shift in her heart. The anger and betrayal were still there, but they were joined by a recognition of what they had all lost during 35 years of separation. That evening, after Marcus and his family had returned home, Isabella found Edmund sitting alone on the terrace, staring out at the sunset. "They're wonderful children," she said, settling into the chair beside him. "They are. And Marcus is an excellent father. Sarah is remarkable too." They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, both of them processing the emotions of the day. "What happens now?" Isabella asked finally. Edmund turned to look at her, and she saw something in his expression that had been missing for weeks: hope. "I don't know," he admitted. "Marcus wants to maintain a relationship, but he's also made it clear that he doesn't want or expect public recognition. He's built a good life, and he doesn't want to complicate it unnecessarily. And what do you want? I want to be part of his life, if he'll allow it. I want to know my granddaughters. I want to make up for some of the lost time, even though I know that's impossible." Isabella nodded, understanding that this was likely the best resolution they could hope for. "And what about us? What about our marriage?" Edmund reached for her hand, relieved when she didn't pull away. "I want to rebuild what I damaged. I want to earn back your trust, even if it takes the rest of our lives. I want us to move forward together, with honesty this time." Isabella squeezed his hand gently, not quite ready to forgive but willing to begin the difficult work of healing. "It won't be easy. There will be days when I'm angry all over again, when I remember how long you kept this from me. I understand. I'll spend, however long it takes, proving that I'm worthy of your forgiveness." As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, both of them understood that their marriage had been fundamentally changed by Edmund's confession and its aftermath. But perhaps, with time and effort and the inclusion of the family members they had never known, it could become something stronger and more honest than it had ever been before. The secret that had haunted Edmund for 35 years was finally in the open, and while the future remained uncertain, it was no longer built on deception. For the first time in decades, the truth had set them all free to discover what their family could become.